A Friday afternoon town, a caller to a public radio program insisted that we man up and stop whining and accept that these things happen and there's nothing we can do about it. For one blazing moment, I wanted to reach through the ether to West Virginia and shake him. And then I said to myself, why is he wrong? In that moment, it was vitally important to answer, why was he wrong? Don't we spend a goodly part of our lives accepting things as they are and teaching our kids to do the same? Just one of life's hard lessons, we say. Or like Rebecca Parker, we don't recognize that when that thing is happening like an invisible tidal wave, it demands our immediate response. The world as it is for us in the here and now is a world that is steeped in violence and steeped in domination. They are, as the caller suggested, embedded in our culture. And it has been so since the settling of the American continents by the Europeans through conquest and genocide and slavery. Now, Europeans didn't invent these things, but they wielded them with terrible efficiency. Now, in the here and now, we may have changed our public and political attitude somewhat. In our polite society, it is criminal to engage in slavery or mob violence. You have to look elsewhere to find it, but you don't have to look hard. Martin Luther King Jr. named the three great scourges of the world as racism, war, and poverty, and he called them violence of the spirit and violence of the flesh. Violence and our attitudes toward it are in the very air we breathe. They are unconscious, and they are, for the most part, unchallenged. They are in the very structures of power that fuel our economy and our creature comforts. Violence bombards every aspect of our lives. It is in the values that we have inherited. It is in our acknowledged and in our histories that we don't speak of. We are insulated of this with our ignorance of our very presence and our past. In her essay, A Struggle to Inhabit My Country, Rebecca Parker talked about driving through that Pennsylvania countryside and seeing the signs of flooding, the sandbags, the closed roads, the blinking lights. And then they rounded that bend and they saw that sheet of water rising and realized the flooding hadn't occurred in the past. It was here and now, and they had to abandon that vehicle and escape the raging waters. This is what it is like to be white or privileged in America. Parker writes, it's to travel well ensconced in a secure vehicle, to see signs of what is happening in the world outside of the compartment that one is traveling in, and to not realize that these signs have any contemporary meaning. It is, she writes, to be dislocated, to misjudge your location and to believe that you are uninvolved and unaffected by what is happening in the world. To come of age in America as a white person, she continues, is to be educated into ignorance. It is to be culturally shaped not to know and not to want to know the actual context in which you live. What is the context in which we live? I don't know about you, but I have a harder time grabbing hold of big picture ideas as a great motivator. They are not enough to help me to commit myself to truth. If I have to commit myself to truth, It means I have to give up something, some of my safety and my comfort and my security. And that's a hard thing. And the big picture isn't going to do it for me. I first started justice work years ago, and I realized that I had to anchor myself in very personal and particular stories for any kind of change in my thinking to take root. To discover a context for me, I had to start by delving into my family history. And I found a very thick and dusty folder in a drawer in my mother's attic. It was filled with a very carefully researched genealogy that had been completed in the 1930s. No one, and least of all my mom, knew or remembered that it was there. And I began to read. On her 7th birthday, my great-grandmother, Kate Waldrop, received 25 slaves. She told my grandmother, "When your grandfather married Miss Gregory, her father objected because grandfather only owned 2 slaves, while he already owned many." Grandfather's 2 slaves were Aunt Lucy and Long Rachel. Long Rachel bore 22 children, and her progeny founded his slave fortune, which was at the 400 mark when the Emancipation Act freed them. And he had given each of his children a dowry of slaves when they married, so he gave me, the baby, 25 slaves for my own when I was 7. These included Aunt Liz, who raised me as my black mammy after the death of my own mother. She was still living in Mississippi in 1914 when last I heard from her. She was at least 90 years old then, or older. I came to Texas when I was 16 to be with my brothers. I left my father and my stepmother on our plantation in New Albany, Mississippi, and I never saw my father again. The 1860 census for New Albany, Mississippi reports with brutal accuracy that my great-great-grandfather owned 422 human beings. Most of the men and women and children were not listed by name, but by description. And the very last person on that list was a 3.5-year-old girl child. In a 1937 letter, one Waldrop cousin, who was the most enthusiastic of the genealogists, gushed, "From all accounts, H was a kind slave owner." I read those words and I cringe. But there was more to the story, because wonder of wonders, Auntie Liz's letters to Kate have been preserved. And they are chatty and they are full of tenderness. They are windows into a world that Lizzie created. She somehow overcame the abomination of slavery, and she created these bonds of affection with this little child and made a loving and a lasting relationship. She was the only mother that Kate ever knew, and she taught her how to be a loving mother to her own children. I have some of those letters, and here's one from February 17th in 1899. Dear honey, well, you don't have any idea how glad I was to get your letter. Just to see those lines and think whose fingers wrote it made the tears come in my eyes and my heart leap for joy. Well, we are all very well and getting along as well as could be expected. All the children are with me but Bernia. She is married and she has 6 children. I have 1 boy and 3 girls with me. They are all smart and good children and well thought of by white and black. I will send you our pictures as soon as we can get them taken, and I will be most sure to send you mine. I will be so glad to get your picture. I want to see how you look, so be sure and send it soon. What church do you belong to? I am a Methodist, and all my children, but John, who since has left for Chicago. I am trying to live here so that I may have a home in heaven when I die. And I hope when I get there, I will find all of my dear ones that have gone on before me. Well, I will quit for this time. I hope it won't be long before I hear from you again and get that picture. And I'm going to send you a nice present, too. Always think of me as your fond old nurse, Lizzie Waldrop. There was a great fire, a great barn fire, that burned almost everything that Kate brought with her to Texas. But she saved these letters. Auntie Liz's letters to Kate are filled with sweet and unshakable love. They were kin because Lizzie made them so. For years, throughout all of her childhood, Kate owned Auntie Liz. And that they created a loving bond between them does not mitigate for me the terrible sin that my great-great-grandfather and his father-in-law chose to commit. The knowledge of my family history has weighed heavily upon me for a long time. Slavery and the racism that fuels it is a manifestation of violence that still pervades our society today, and it will until we come to terms with it. But how easy it is not to. Instead, like that West Virginia caller, we reconcile ourselves. That is what we do when we face horror that just lasts for years and years until it is a way of life. We adjust to it. We survive. We make the terrible normal. This is how we sustain ourselves when we are surrounded by evil. Today, there are 27 million slaves in our country and around the world, and they sustain our way of life, and they provide us with entertainment. Most of us are ignorant of this, just as we are ignorant of the evils that our society inflicts on most of us, so the rest of us can live in some kind of comfort. We carve out corners for our lives. We love an orphaned child. We do good deeds. You know this already. One of the things that I love about this congregation is how much you support causes that are near and dear to you to try and redress some of these things. You support fair trade. You support incredible efforts to help victims of disasters. But we will never get at the root of the thing that sickens our culture and the context in which we live until we rise up out of our lives and hold ourselves personally accountable for the well-being of strangers. Continuing on this journey means that we hold ourselves accountable for the things that seem beyond our control. One of the guests on that radio talk show about Newtown was my colleague, the Reverend Josh Powlek from Manchester, Connecticut. And he responded to this fellow by saying he found his attitude distressing and painful and completely untrue. He reminded us that if we were all to man up and accept things as they are, that we would never have had an end to slavery, never have had civil rights for people of color and women and gays. And I would go further. If we were all to man up and accept things as they are, there would be no United States. There would be no medicine. there would be no justice. There would be no religion. We have to reject the world as it is to start a revolution. We have to reject the world as it is to cure our ills and repair our bodies. We have to reject the world as it is to find truth and fairness in the midst of oppression. And we have to reject the world as it is to be people of faith. To lay down despair and suffering is the great, central, and particular freedom of religion. It is the lesson of religion, of all religions, that it is the little things, the particular things, the ways in which we lead our lives and reach out beyond our lives that make the difference. We may not be power brokers and policymakers, but nevertheless we can and we do make a difference. When enough of us work together on reaching beyond our lives to hold ourselves accountable, then the longed-for tidal wave of justice can and will rise up wherever it has to find itself, and hope and history will rhyme.